Welcome. My name is Michael Edgar with SelectChicago. I wanted to thank you all very much for coming to this special pop-up presentation of the SelectChicago FDI Workshop Series. Today we're here to talk about why geopolitics matters for U.S. businesses, a discussion on Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Baltics. We're here because the geopolitics has a significant and underappreciated impact on U.S. businesses. Arguably, nowhere is this more true in the geopolitics of Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Baltics. We're really excited to be here today. We have over 300 people registered for this event. This program is going to be recorded, so if you didn't make it here on time and missed something, in about a week we will be running this thing through post-production and getting everybody links to this. Throughout the program, we have our interns monitoring chat, so please put in your questions to the group, and we'll try and answer these during the Q&A session. A little about SelectChicago. We have a lot of new people today. We have about 100 people that are part of the SelectChicago community, and we have a number of people from the IRI community, as well as people that are just looking to see what this is all about. So SelectChicago is a not-for-profit organization that helps global investors and foreign companies enter, distribute, and invest in the greater Chicago region by facilitating resources, connections, and capital. SelectChicago works at the intersection between municipalities, trade commissioners, and global investors, and we help foster bilateral foreign direct investment. This is really key and why we're really excited to be working with IRI today. A little bit about the SelectChicago FDI Workshop Series. It's a monthly program. We've had over 100 speakers in the last 6 months. We've discussed all facets of foreign direct investment. We've introduced 30 companies looking to set up shop in the greater Chicago region. And the greater Chicago region, when we talk about it, is an area roughly 300 kilometers from Chicago's O'Hare Airport. What allows us to do this within this not-for-profit framework is that we work across 5 states in all different municipalities. So this allows everybody that's coming to us from abroad a one-stop shop. There's over 50 trade offices in the Chicago area. We work with all of them. During the show notes, a little bit later, you're going to learn some more about how you can learn more about SelectChicago, our programming, and more about our sponsors. Today, we have Dr. Daniel Twinning, who's the IRI president, Stephen Nix, for IRI's Eurasia Regional Director, and Steve Kim, over to my left. He's a partner at RKF Global. And so kind of the agenda today is we're going to have opening remarks starting with Dan, and then we'll go to Steve Nix and Steve Kim, and then have a panel discussion on the implications of this region on global democracy, stability, and the U.S. business interest, followed by some Q&A. So I'm going to turn this over to Dan to introduce himself a little bit further and go to his prepared remarks. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Okay, super. Thanks, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and Steve and so many friends in Chicago. Our late vice chairman, Senator Rich Williamson, really had given us such a strong Chicago connection for so many years as the deputy to our former chairman, John McCain, who led IRI for 25 years. Senator Mark Kirk is on our board. We had a super trip out there in the BC era before COVID, and we're looking forward to coming back soon. Maybe I could just say a word about IRI, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion with all of you. So we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization set up in 1983 as a core institute of the National Endowment for Democracy. And this was part of a vision laid out by President Ronald Reagan and supported very strongly by a then Democratic Congress to help the U.S. lead a global campaign for democracy. This idea that not just our material power, but really the power of our values is essential to who we are as well as to what we do in the world is a big part of what helped win the Cold War. The universal aspiration to democracy, to human dignity, to individual freedom. Nobody in Moscow or in the Soviet Empire could control that. And of course, we have all reaped the benefits since of a Europe increasingly whole, open, free, and at peace. This has obviously been very good from a business perspective as well as a geopolitical perspective. Times have changed a lot since then. Our work is more important than ever. We're very proud to be continuing this role of advancing democracy and good governance around the world. Michael, we've got programming in some 90 countries. We have 60 overseas offices. Some of the work that we do includes training on democratic governance, women's empowerment, civil society, youth leadership, electoral processes, helping countries run free and fair elections, including in the long run-up period to elections, as well as in the post-election period. We do a lot of research, including survey research, to really educate lawmakers and political leaders around citizen priorities so that they can run citizen-centric governments that are not personality-driven, but really policy-driven, responsive to citizen needs. So that's a bit about us. What's going on in the global campaign for democracy today? In some respects, the news is not great. We see China and the Chinese Communist Party really maximizing central control through really malign forms of surveillance and weaponization of information and influence operations around the world. We see a tough crackdown in Russia on a growing civic democratic movement, which my colleague Steve will say a lot more about. We see power grabs in various countries where leaders were elected democratically. Turkey, the Philippines, elsewhere, but really have consolidated and abused emergency authorities. So there is tough news, including in really difficult countries like Venezuela, where a dictator continues to cling to power. But we also see people standing up and fighting everywhere, literally everywhere, for more rights and freedoms, for a greater voice in their politics, their political life, for leaders who represent and are accountable to them, rather than to oligarchic or private interests. So we hear a much different story from citizens around the world. We'll talk more about what that looks like in Eurasia with Steve and all of you here to focus in a bit on that critical region. But beyond Belarus and Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, etc., we've also, of course, seen people standing up, including in closing space environments in Burma, in Hong Kong, again, in Venezuela, around the Middle East. So the desire for democratic dignity is universal. And we see our role as really walking with partners towards a more democratic future. Our new president, supported very strongly by Republicans in Congress, as well as Democrats in Congress, I think understands the centrality of democracy and human rights. We are in an era now of great power competition, in which foreign authoritarian great powers have weaponized election interference, propaganda, and disinformation campaigns, and other influence operations against us and our democratic allies. So we really see an essential strategic need to push back against what we call Russian and Chinese sharp power, in particular. Sharp power because it's malign and subversive, to distinguish it from the kind of soft power that open societies produce. And we really would just underline the stake for business leaders, as well as for all Americans, in protecting and sustaining a free and open world in which countries broadly play by rules. And there are rules in which international commerce is conducted, rather than those rules being hijacked or subservient to the Chinese Communist Party or the Kremlin or other actors who very much do not have our interests at heart. Finally, could I just say, that we know that effective, strong, accountable institutions, open societies, transparent political systems are vital to economic prosperity. Other than a few Gulf states sitting on massive energy resources, all of the world's advanced economies are rule of law societies, are open societies. I mean, look at the difference. For all the conversation around China's inexorable rise under one man, one party rule, look at Taiwan next door, which is a Chinese society 5 to 6 times richer than China, effective institutions, clean elections, responsive politics, vigorous, independent, free media, and civil society. The Taiwan model is a superior model, and we've seen that across Asia as countries have modernized, they have opened up and democratized. That's been really good for business, really good for development and growth. We also just see that dictatorships are rife with corruption and incompetence. Most dictatorships look nothing like China under the CCP. Most dictatorships end up looking like Venezuela or Zimbabwe or other failed states. that clearly are not only abusive of their citizens' rights, but really fundamentally are not contributors to the international economy and to global development. So we really see a central role for the private sector across America in helping to sustain the free and open world that is safe for us and our values, but also very much for our interests, including our commercial interests. That the continuing campaign to develop and deepen democracy around the world goes hand in hand with human and economic development around the world. So your voices really are crucial. We look forward to hearing from you. And I just like to thank you at Chicago Select for having us today and look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Michael.
First of all, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Steve, for having us here today. Dan did an excellent job of outlining the issues and the bridge between democracy building and free enterprise. What I'd like to do is just discuss a couple of trends that we're seeing in the Eurasia and Europe region, and then go into some more detail perhaps about IRI's role in those trends. And I'll say, first of all, at the outset, there's a lot of hand-wringing going on in terms of the state of democracy worldwide today. Freedom House just came out with their annual index of democracy and reports that democracy is in decline, in their words, worldwide. But in the Eurasia region, we see some outliers. There are three, really. First and foremost, I'd like to talk about the democratic movements that have emerged in both Russia and Belarus that Dan alluded to. And then secondly, you've got countries like Ukraine and Moldova that are still struggling, but inexorably moving westward, because that's what our polling data says that the people want and desire in terms of their future. And then third, you've got countries like Lithuania, established democracies, EU countries, NATO countries that are helping these other countries I mentioned previously in the fight for building democracy and for free markets. So I'll start first with Russia. You've all been reading about current events in Russia. Let me just say that there is an active movement built around Alexei Navalny that is growing strength in the Russian Federation today. As you all know, Navalny is incarcerated. The leadership of the movement now really rests with a man named Leonid Volkov. Leonid Volkov managed Navalny's mayoral campaign, was forced to flee Russia, and is now resident in Vilnius, Lithuania. And it's important for your audience, Michael, to understand that the Navalny movement is increasingly becoming more of an offshore movement. More and more of the operatives and leaders of Navalny's movement are being forced to leave the Russian Federation and are now resident in Vilnius, Lithuania. So that's an important point, and we see that trend continuing. We have our sights set, as does the Navalny movement, on the September Duma elections. And the opposition plans to target seats in certain cities. And we have hope and confidence that the movement will have some success to the point where some pro-reform, anti-corruption, pro-Western deputies might be allowed to take their seats in the Duma. So that's Russia in brief, and I'll be happy to go into much more detail later. Secondly would be Belarus, another organic national movement that has really gained a lot of momentum. And it's a fascinating story. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is the leader of the opposition movement in Belarus. 1 year ago, she was a homemaker and part-time school teacher. Now she's the leader of a national movement that again is gaining great momentum throughout Belarus. And we saw this in polling data that we had, that Belarusians wanted change in government. They wanted a change in their lives. And she seized upon that. Her husband, Sergei Tikhanovskaya, was imprisoned for daring to run against Alexander Lukashenko for the presidency. Svetlana took over the movement after her husband was incarcerated and now enjoys broad support. She also was forced to leave the country and is resident in Vilnius, Lithuania. That's where the movement is now centered. So you've got not one, but two very critical pro-democracy movements in the former Soviet space that are now centered, headquartered in teeny tiny Vilnius. But importantly, we see that this movement is gaining strength. The government is clearly terrified of this movement. This week, the government announced that it was investigating Tikhanovskaya for terrorism. So it gives you an idea of the fear that they have of this woman and the support that she has. We have data that tells us that she likely won the presidential election outright and should be the duly elected president now. She is negotiating for new elections. And again, she's under great pressure in Vilnius. Her movement's under great pressure in Belarus from the authorities, but we see this opposition movement gaining strength. Third, Ukraine and Moldova. Ukraine, in fits and starts, continues its march towards Europe and building democratic structures. It's led now by President Zelensky, who has struggled at times. But again, we see movement, we see progress. We see that the numbers tell us the vast majority of Ukrainians want to see their country part of Europe, both as an EU member, and our data tells us the majority would like to see this country in NATO. Obviously, the Russian threat in the east and from the south is a very, very serious threat to Ukraine. I'll go into this later because there's news reports of military buildups in both places on the Russian side. This really, really is becoming a very critical issue and is weighing upon Ukraine and its progress towards Europe. And then finally, Moldova, teeny tiny Moldova, where a pro-EU, pro-Western president, Maya Sandu, was elected. She is calling for early parliamentary elections. Our data tells us that her movement, again, pro-Europe, pro-reform, will defeat the Socialist Party in early parliamentary elections if they are held. I have run out of my time. I'll stop there, but look forward into getting to more detail in all of these countries.
Hello. Hi, my name is Steve Kim, and I'm with RKF Global PLLC. We are a law firm that assists U.S. and international clients located all throughout the world, and especially in locations where customs, rules, regulations are very different from where we are right now. I also had the wonderful opportunity in 2019 to be an election observer with the IRI election team in the country of Ukraine for the parliamentary election. I was stationed over at their old capital, Kharkiv, and it was such a great experience. I recall being there and monitoring the counting of ballots into the wee hours of the morning the next day. It really gave me a lot of faith in the democratic process in Ukraine, but also the incredible job that organizations such as IRI does throughout the world. And we're here really to hear more from Stephen Nix and Danielle Twining, but I just want to give maybe a brief overview and connection of why I believe it is very important that organizations like IRI actually connect with the business community. We understand it's very daunting for U.S. companies as they not only tackle the business opportunities in various markets, but we'll also need to consider various rules and regulations of these foreign countries, but also laws that are important here in the United States, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We as American service providers and the companies we support needs assistance. And most of the time we do go to our embassies, our local consulates, chambers of commerce, and they do a wonderful job in providing American businesses with support. And however, I think most entities may not realize that, where does IRI kind of come into the picture, and organizations such as IRI. I believe that the work of IRI is a key asset for American businesses. IRI's work in monitoring elections to ensure fair and transparent elections are so important as American businesses enter a country. We all understand that stability is a major factor when American businesses start looking at decision processes and whether entering a market or not. And I believe IRI's stamp of election fairness approval goes a long way to political and economic stability in many of these countries that IRI operates in. IRI's work in building citizen-centered governments, linking political parties and its people, countering foreign authoritative influence, all help in bringing stability, transparency, fairness, and rule of law that is so central and critical to success for any American businesses in an unknown market. And also in many ways, I see IRI as a mini embassy. IRI operates in over 40 countries, has staff in all of these countries, and have staff there that have been in these countries for many years. As we all know, U.S. embassies and consulates have diplomats that are there for 3-4 years and have to move on. But there are many in IRI in these countries that have been there for many years, and really they have a wonderful bird's eye viewpoint of what's happening on the ground in these countries and can provide wonderful information and can be a great asset to American businesses.
What I think we'll do is really kind of get into a panel discussion. I think just talking some more, leveraging off of what Steve Kim had just said is, I'll kind of put this out to Dan to talk a little bit about the history of IRI, but also that I want to hear some of your feedback of the importance of longevity. And Steve Kim was just mentioning how important it is to have a long tenure with boots on the ground. So why don't you start us off with talking about that, Dan?
Thanks, Michael. So I really appreciate the comments, Steve, and your point is a good one, that greater democratic inclusion and participation enhances stability, that there's some idea that authoritarian government is somehow more stable, and it may look that way on the surface, but underneath, of course, it's brittle and can crumble or can lead to events, as we've seen from Belarus to Burma to Russia, which really look like the opposite of stability. So this idea that countries are much more stable when they go through regular elections, have free media, have active civil society who participates in political life, have a kind of politics that is responsive to popular concerns, I think that's just spot on. In terms of kind of thinking a little more about the business question, it is apparent that there are competing models out there now. I think there was a time after the Cold War, Michael, going to your point about kind of history and longevity. There was a point where in the 90s, democracy looked like the only possible system. It turns out that, of course, this thousands-year struggle between autocracy and freedom is not over. There is a Putin model, which is oligarchic and kleptocratic and corrupt. There is a Chinese Communist Party model, which really seeks total control. And of course, all of us who live in advanced societies, not just America, but advanced societies around the world, know that you can't have total control by politicians, particularly unelected, unaccountable politicians, that that's just not possible, nor is it good for human welfare or business predictability. So we're very proud to have worked in many countries and with many partners in many countries for a very long time, in some cases for 25, 30 years in the same country. And that does bring a level of credibility to what we do and a set of relationships. I would just like to pick up, there was a comment in the chat about, sort of touting American democracy or somehow exporting American democracy. We're not in the business of doing that. There are many, many different kinds of democratic models around the world. One thing we like to do is share democratic best practices. So Steve mentioned the excellent work that our partners in the Baltics do. In the Baltic States that are members of the EU, that are advanced democracies, sophisticated democracies now, but were once part of the Soviet Empire. We do parliamentary exchanges between Baltic democracies and emerging democratic parliaments in countries that only in the last 5 to 10 years made the transition to democracy. So here we have Europeans learning from each other. Some in the European Union, some from beyond the European Union, about best practices. So a lot of our work really is not about coming in and saying, we're the Americans and let us tell you what to do. Actually, none of our work does that. It is very much about sharing democratic best practices and really building up this global architecture of democracy, of small d Democrats who can support each other. And, those people really, really, really want our help. Because believe it or not, they know that Americans have been working on our democracy for 245 years, and we had a lot of lessons to share, including from, as you say, our work in some historically over 100 countries around the world. We do have some lessons to share.
Okay, so Steve Nix, why don't you follow up with what Dan was just talking about that boots on the ground, what it's like being there over a period of time?
Sure. Well, I'd like to augment 2 points that Dan made, that one and another one about stability. Businesses seek stability. The Slavic term for that is stabilnost. And businesses seek that. And as Dan points out, countries that build democratic institutions are better equipped to provide that sense of stabilnost to businesses in the former Soviet space. The second thing is the longevity, the experience, the presence. I think it's critical to our mission to have experienced people. Most of my country directors, we have offices in most, but not all of the former Soviet republics. Some of them have been with us for 15, 20 years. They're experts in the field. We require everybody in the field to speak Russian or the indigenous language. So we really are respectful of local custom, tradition, language, those sort of things, which are developed over years. And in terms of longevity, I think the key to success for Eurasia, for me personally in this line of work, and I think for the Institute, is building relationships over the long term. Building relationships, building trust. And in the former Soviet space, that requires time and effort, as I'm sure your members know. People are not willing to give trust at the outset. It takes time to build these relationships, takes time to build trust. And again, what I convey to my people in the field is very, very clearly, if IRI says that they're going to do something, we will do it. And our partners rely on that. Again, I think that's testimony to our presence in these countries for some time. Democracy takes time. And luckily, our funders, primarily state and USAID, understand that political transitions like Ukraine's, like Georgia's, and others don't take place overnight. It requires time, it requires patience, it requires financing, financial support for these movements. And so that's why all of these factors combine to longevity and experience, building those relationships are essential to the success that we enjoy at IRI.
Okay, great. So Steve Kim, why don't you talk about some of the experience you have? I mean, you've been in a lot of these countries over the last 10 years. You and I have talked a lot of times during after hours about your experience there. So why don't you talk about your experience boots on the ground?
Well, I think we as a firm have a lot of clients in the Eurasia part of the world, but we not only work with U.S. companies, but we also work with companies throughout the world. And one thing that we have seen that is very important to the business community is not really whether or not that there are any type of programs that certain governments can provide that help one industry over another, but I keep on, I think, going back and relating to the importance of a kind of a democratic society that offers stability and, very importantly, the rule of law. Because I believe that most businesses, whether you're in the U.S. or throughout the world, they want to be treated equally and they want to have free and fair competition as they are marketing their business in in different parts of the world. They don't want to have to understand, okay, which government official that they need to speak to at this time, who's in power today, who may be in power tomorrow. Most businesses do not want to work on all of those political issues. They want to handle the expertise of selling their wares in those countries, and that is critical when there is democracy, when there's transparency, when there is rule of law in those countries, where all companies are treated equally under the rule of law. And I believe that that is something that we have seen as a common trend for companies throughout the world, entering any markets throughout the world.
Wonderful. So, what are some of the things that IRI is looking to do in the Baltic areas, right now? I mean, Steve, Nix, you were talking about some new information that was coming on. It's in the papers today. Why don't you go over some of the things you're seeing and why that's important for businesses and for the American people at large?
Well, sure. First of all, in terms of discussing the Baltics, again, I have to go back to the fact that two of the key transformational movements in my region, in Russia and in Belarus, are being headquartered currently in Vilnius, Lithuania. So you've got a country of 3 million people hosting these two movements. And there are more coming. We expect more arrests. We expect more investigations against Navalny's group, and not just Navalny's group, but Khodorkovsky's group, Open Russia, and others within the Russian Federation. And we see these people increasingly leaving the Russian Federation and going to a place where they feel safe and where they can operate. So again, it's very important that countries in the Baltics, like Lithuania, are willing to support these movements. It comes at some cost. They suffer the slings and arrows of the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Russian security services. But Lithuania is willing to take on that challenge. The same with the other Baltic countries. Have been very, very supportive of Ukraine's independence, its territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression. Because again, let's face it, the Baltic countries realize that if Ukraine can't hold the line against Russian military aggression, the Baltics are next. So they have a real stake in this. So very, very important in a number of respects. Another thing I'll add is that Lithuania, for the last 10 years, has hosted a parliamentary training center in Vilnius, where IRI merely brings members of parliament from Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and now Armenia to Vilnius for training. The Lithuanians do all this training. The reason for this, and a lot of members of these parliaments have asked me, well, why not bring these people to Washington, to Congress? And the reason is very simple, because parliamentary structures are much more in tune in Europe with post-Soviet states than the American system. Secondly, Lithuania provides a prime example for the countries that I've listed. It started out as a former Soviet republic and transformed into a member of the EU and a member of NATO. And that's exactly the transformation these countries want to see. So a lot of the training is about EU accession legislation. What laws do Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia have to adopt to be eligible for EU membership? So that's a primary focus of that. But there's also business interests. I mean, Ukrainian MPs were interested in learning, how did Lithuania diversify its energy requirements? How did Lithuania become independent of Russian oil and gas? So we took the Ukrainians, for example, to the LNG terminal that has been built in Klaipėda, a port city in the Baltic Sea, which receives liquefied natural gas from Texas and other states in the United States. They wanted to see how this worked. So there's a business component to this as well as a democratic and governance component. And Lithuania is our strongest partner, but we receive lots of support from our friends in Latvia and Estonia as well.
Great. Well, one of the things that that I've gotten more familiar with IRI is that a lot of the folks in the states don't really understand what that transition is like. So once we've gone from a autocracy to a fledgling democracy, it's not flipping a switch. So can you guys talk about some of the things you do in the early stages? Because Lithuania is a great example of a 25-year process, slow and steady, to get to its strength position now. Can you walk us through when you come into a fledgling republic or democracy, and what does IRI do at that time?
Michael, maybe I could give just a generic example, and then Steve could give a more country-specific example. I mean, Steve, Armenia is an interesting case because, of course, they only quite recently had a peaceful democratic transition. But broadly, Michael, democracy is an entire system. It's not just the departure of a dictator. It's not just holding an election. One of the reasons that the Arab Spring was so stillborn in so many countries, despite the fervor continuing to bubble even today for greater freedom and dignity in so many Arab countries, is that those effective institutions, those effective civic structures just were missing. And so the dictator would fall in Egypt or elsewhere, and there would be nothing underneath to rise up and kind of fill the governance gap. So we have a menu of things that we would help a new emerging transitional democracy do, which would include polling to help politicians understand what are citizen priorities, would include parliamentary training, because of course what you don't want is an overweening executive. What you want is a balance of power, a system of checks and balances, parliamentary oversight. There could be media training. That's not, a lot of other groups do that work, but we do some of that around how do you have effective media oversight. There would be a very active program of civic engagement with civil society organizations. They are very effective watchdogs in many countries in holding governments accountable. And then there would be, frankly, just a lot of really nuts and bolts training. For a parliamentarian, how do you organize a staff? How do you hold a committee hearing? How do you move legislation? Here are different examples we can bring from different countries similar to yours. For an executive, a prime minister, how do you run an executive office? How do you interact with parliament? How do you interact with the citizens, the other agencies of government? Steve, maybe a little more specificity from you, just picking a country, if you would.
Sure, and I'll go to several. Thank you, Dan. Well, first of all, it's a broad scope of events. Once there is a political transition, what we really do is try to concentrate on what Steve Kim said, is working to build the rule of law through the courts, the legal system, which is very, very important for stability, for the business community, but also for democratic responsiveness. So rule of law is very important. We focus on that. Other countries, I'll go back to Ukraine for a second. Local governance. We all saw the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, where there was a transformation from a corrupt pro-Russian oligarch to a new democracy in Ukraine. Where we have focused on Ukraine is decentralization, because that, people forget, was one of the key demands of the revolution of dignity. People wanted to empower cities and local government in decision-making and resource allocation, all of these things. So we've had a very, very robust training program for training city council members and mayors in governance. And we have seen some very positive results from this. When you look at IRI polling, we do specific polling nationally in Ukraine, but also we poll every year in the 24 largest cities. I mean, this is a huge poll. You have to remember that in the post-Soviet space, telephone polling simply doesn't work. People will not talk to a pollster over a phone. You have to do face-to-face polling, which is time-consuming and expensive. So, for example, our most recent national poll in Ukraine, we polled 14,000 people in face-to-face interviews. But what we were able to glean from this data is that citizens in Ukraine actually see reform and change in their local communities vis-a-vis the national government. So it's in localities where people see change, people see reform, people see improvement. And that's because of this decentralization program, which allowed local government to have a greater say in how tax income was used and provide services to citizens. So local governance is one, rule of law is another. As Dan pointed out, working with legislative branches, which we do in the Armenia case, again, to put in place structure, but most importantly, to communicate with the public. During the pandemic, we organized the very first online parliamentary hearings in Armenia's history. Now, this was due to the pandemic, but it was such a success that we want to continue this once things open up and more in-person events take place, because we were able to produce such a large audience and give citizens the opportunity to ask questions of their elected representatives on specific issues. And this was health issues during the pandemic. This was international affairs, foreign affairs. This is also environment issues. So again, we work in very different segments. And that's just a few of the examples where we work to try to build democratic institutions once a democratic transition takes place. We anticipate doing the same in Belarus and in Russia whenever those transformations are complete.
Great. Now, Steve Nix, I'm going to let Steve Kim talk a little bit about the importance of IRI from the legal perspective. He's a practicing attorney, and he brings a lot of information to bear on this.
The concept, of rule of law, judicial system, they're very different from every country. And to just say, well, our system or our way is better than others, I think that that's a bit of a naive statement. As I was saying kind of in my previous comments, the importance of the rule of law is to ensure that companies are treated fairly, equally, that political corruption, other illegal factors don't become components of making a business decision. And that's where I think a lot of the things and a lot of the mission of what IRI does comes into effect within our own business community and the rule of law. IRI's mission and the offices and the directors that the IRI has throughout the world, they understand the importance of how the rule of law and the impact of having fairness and transparency has throughout the business community also. And working with, I think, the business community, working with attorneys, there's a lot of things that IRI has done that has, I think, created a platform for these countries to understand that having a foundation in law and having a foundation in fairness and transparency can also bring about great amounts of economic development. Economic development, as you said, as we were talking before, it's a process, and it's a process that includes not just the government, not just the business community, but many other different types of organizations, not-for-profit agencies, organizations such as IRI, all coming together, working together, and demonstrating throughout the world and to the business community that this country is able to do business in a fair and equitable manner. And I think that's what's very important for organizations like IRI to work with also the business communities, the legal communities, and also, not other types of not-for-profit communities, so that governments understand that economic progress and economic development is not something that's such a very quick and rush aspect, but something that all different types of organizations have to be involved in.
Yeah, and I'll pick up a little bit off of what Steve was saying is when we're working with the 50 trade commissioners in the Chicago region, they're all asking us that same question of how do we get businesses from the United States to come and set up shop in our country. I think because where we sit when we're helping businesses come in from abroad, we get the standard laundry list of we're coming to the United States because of rule of law, settlements and transactions, a stable currency, an open market, a free market. These are some of the things these businesses that are coming from all around the world are looking to do as they set up here. And what I've been really fascinated and excited to hear about IRI's platform across the world in the countries that you're working in is you're helping embed those type of programs and establishments. So if we're helping somebody from Lithuania, because the trade office in Lithuania is a dear friend of mine, and we're looking for a business to set up there, we're comfortable saying, yes, 30 years ago, it had a different regime. Now this is the rule of law that they have here, and this is how they're better able to set up a U.S. subsidiary abroad. So these are some of the reasons why I know I'm excited to work with IRI with the programs that you're putting in. I want to ask a question of Steve Nix of just on, when businesses are coming across, how can a U.S. business interface with you there in any of the countries that you're working with?
Sure. Well, we often do get requests. Our offices are available and open to U.S. investors who might be visiting a certain country. We meet often. I work very closely with the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, for example. I just gave a presentation on Ukraine to that group last week. So we are interested in forging relationships because at the outset, as Dan Twining said, the bridge, the relationship between building democratic institutions and building free markets is very, very important. So, as I said in our informal conversation, Michael, if you go to Vilnius, we'll be happy to connect you up with our staff there. But we'd be happy to talk to members of your association that might be traveling in countries where IRI has offices. We can give you a very good, in-depth political brief on what's going on in the country and talk a little bit about the investment environment as well.
Great. And then Dan, in addition to what we have in Russia and Eastern Europe, can you touch on some of the other countries you're in around the world?
We work all over the world. We work in many countries in very different ways. I mean, we do a lot of work in Europe, for instance, where broadly democratic development is highly advanced. And a lot of that work is around building political party alliances because the common issues challenging democracies are shared across borders. So we do a lot of kind of political alliance, coalition building work, a lot of work collectively with European partners around protecting our democracies against Russian Kremlin disinformation, for instance, tracking, destructive forms of illiberal speech, extremist, foreign-sponsored rhetoric on social media to help politics stay centered rather than driven to the extremes. We do a lot of work in transitional and developing democracies where governments are openly requesting our help. And then we also support democratic activists working in very, very tough conditions in closed spaces, closed societies, where governments are simply not allowing their citizens to have even a modicum of a voice, even to do the most basic forms of political organization. One area, Michael, which I think is really important just for this audience, is just the domain of technology. That really, just to take elections as an example, if you're an electoral autocrat whose country is having an election and you want to steal it, you can steal it well before election day using electoral-related technologies, digital technologies, to tilt the playing field. You can also, of course, use technology to censor free and critical media in the run-up to a campaign. So an increasing amount of work that we do is around technology and helping democratic activists navigate the digital opportunities, but also, frankly, protect themselves. There are a lot of hostile governments, starting with the Chinese Communist Party, but including many, many governments that want to use this new suite of surveillance technologies to not just spy on, but really close down opposing political voices. So helping small d Democrats communicate with each other securely, be able to organize online in secure fashion, and also connect with fellow citizens using technology is really important, because in the wrong hands, in the hands of an autocratic repressive regime, as we have seen, for instance, in China and Hong Kong and Xinjiang and elsewhere, these abusive governments are deploying technology in ways that are just so inimical to human freedom and open politics. And so there's just a lot more work to do in that realm specifically all over the world.
Oh, great. And then just as some housekeeping, if whoever's not talking, if we can mute at that time, it helps for a better, clear audio. But one of the questions, and I'm going to put this back to Dan, is the things you're talking about sounds like it takes an immense amount of people. Can you talk about the staff that the IRI has? Because I know it's just more than you and Steve.
Thank you. We've got about 750 colleagues, but really the people who are doing this work, by and large, are not us. I mean, we are working with democratic partners around the world, people in these countries who are campaigning, who are organizing political parties, who are civic activists. I mean, they're the foot soldiers, and they're not doing it for us, they're doing it for themselves. But these are people all over the world who want our help and support, our partnership, our training, some help with capacity building, with communications and other tools to enable them to achieve their democratic aspirations. So I do think it's important, again, to underline that this work is really demand driven. by the craving in the world, in really all societies, for a greater voice, for greater accountability, for more responsive and open politics. That this is not something that we are supplying. It's really something that is out there in demand in the world, and we're just a small piece of the picture. I mean, there's a big infrastructure around the National Endowment for Democracy, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department, other entities of government support various aspects of this work. But last thing I would say, Michael, is just one advantage of the structure of this work is we are a non-governmental organization. We are not an arm of the White House or the State Department or anybody else. And so this structure means that we can do this work independently. We don't create diplomatic conflicts. I mean, the US government itself cannot do a lot of this work because it would create diplomatic complications. So really, we are private actors working with other private actors, in many cases non-government actors. We do it with US government money that we compete for, and we do it with some support from the private sector as well.
Great. And then Dan, a question, because I know I got to meet you 2 years ago when you came to Chicago. What type of outreach is IRI looking to do inside the continental United States to help bolster awareness? Because as we know, because we're working with the different trade offices, it's very easy for us to make referrals that way. But what are some things you have planned post-COVID, past everybody's second jab, of getting the word out about IRI?
Thank you for the question. Really, I mean, we see this work as being intrinsic to who we are as Americans, and so our interest is in getting a greater range of Americans involved in this work. I mean, it's really super that Steve Kim could come observe a Ukrainian election with us. We do a lot of work around local, state level, subnational governance. And so, frankly, a lot of Americans, not just from the private sector, but also from kind of state and local governments, can be very valuable allies to our work abroad in terms of dealing with counterparts, engaging with counterparts there through IRI trainings and exchanges about how it looks. I mean, to give another example from Ukraine, we took the Secretary of State of Ohio, who is responsible for administering the state of Ohio's elections, to Ukraine as part of a similar trip to Steve's. And the Ukrainians were very interested in talking to him about election administration in Ohio versus election administration in their region of Ukraine, right? So there are just a lot of synergies, again, including with the private sector, since we deal with a lot of non-government actors overseas. Our fundamental interest is in getting more Americans, including obviously people listening today, involved in this work.
Great. And then Steve Nix, and then I'll leave it how I'm going to do this now is I'm going to go to Steve Nix, Steve Kim, and then we'll go into some Q&A. And so Steve Nix, when it sounds like you've had a lot of great success coordinating pieces from DC throughout that arena. It's got to be really rewarding working with everything from Armenia, which is on the first baby steps, all the way to Lithuania. So why don't you talk about what drives you for engaging in this work?
Sure. Thank you for that, Michael. Well, I'll confess that like Steve Kim, I have served as a practicing attorney. I was a litigator with one of the big firms in Washington. Never thought I'd set foot in the former Soviet Union, let alone live there, get married there. But I would just say that, for me, the challenge of building democracy is such an enticing thing. I got hooked when I first started traveling to the former Soviet states because I was around people that were talking about democracy, and that became very attractive to me. And so I wanted to be part of this movement. Senator McCain once asked me, we were on a trip to Georgia, and he said, "Steve, do you ever miss the practice of law?" And my answer is, well, no, sir, not really. Occasionally I miss the paycheck, but the work that we're doing is so important, so essential, not just to us as Americans, but the people that we are helping, is so important overall that and so meaningful that no, I don't miss the practice of law. We're very, very engaged in this, and we've had some success in Eurasia, and that also gives us confidence and makes us feel good. The political transitions in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Armenia, and the hope that we now have that we could possibly have democratic transitions in Russia and Belarus, again, are greatly encouraging to us and makes the mission even more important.
Great. Now, the question I may have for Steve Kim on this is similar, but I think it comes down to that brass tacks piece, because he's still a practicing attorney. He had some time in government before he became a practicing attorney. So, Steve, why don't you talk about why you're engaged in that, and then the emotional rewards you are working at that business level in these fledgling transitioning countries.
Well, unfortunately, unlike Steve Nicks, I am still a practicing attorney. Haven't had a better offer yet. But what I've really enjoyed is working with the clients and the businesses that my firm represents in different parts of the world. One thing that I have realized is that we all have different kind of norms and customs and cultures, but all throughout the world, people want a better lives for their families, for themselves, and they're looking for opportunities, economic opportunities, social opportunities, and that's where I feel blessed is coming from the United States and working with not just our government, but organizations like IRI. I think what we're able to do is to offer a different kind of viewpoint through our lenses to these different countries and to the different businesses in these countries of the opportunities that are available to all of them when kind of democracy prevails, when rule of law prevails. And I believe in many ways, not just what our State Department does, but what IRI does, what also private businesses and private attorneys can do in the United States as we work in places throughout the world, is to demonstrate that fairness, transparency, the rule of law, transparency in government, non-corruption in government, really, those are the best aspects that will provide a path to not just monetary success, but also social and economic futures for many of these countries. Because at the end of the day, if you talk to businesses throughout the world and you talk to the owners of these businesses, they're all people that have families that are really looking for an opportunity to better themselves and to better the lives of their families.
Great. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go a little bit longer in going through some Q&A. I mean, Steve's a little bit closer to the monitor than I am of that. If you want to pick one of the questions in our text box. Quite a lot of questions.
Quite a lot
of great.
Questions. I don't think we can do them all. Let's see. Oh, I think this is an interesting question. Either Dan or Stephen, you can maybe answer this. Is asking if there's any report to provide on lessons learned in Romania, Bulgaria, or the multiple states of the former Yugoslavias relevant to today's discussion.
So Romania and Bulgaria are not former states of Yugoslavia, but I think it's an interesting question when we think about countries like Serbia and Bosnia and Slovenia. A couple things. One is organizing. Yugoslavia was a federation. Actually, it's quite similar to Burma today, a federation with many large minorities embedded in it. That cracked up violently and ended up in really the first European war since the Second World War, a very violent and bloody conflict in Bosnia in the 1990s. Extraordinarily, just at the end of the Cold War, when peace and democracy were prevailing in so many countries, including in Europe. And so a reminder that democratic institutions are very effective at mediating passions and conflicts. I mean, we see that all over the world. We see that in our own country. There are lots of passions and conflicts and polarization. But this all devolved into civil war in Yugoslavia because you had the collapse of a dictatorship and then the rise of a new dictatorship led by Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, who ran an ethnic persecution campaign against neighbors that culminated in really a decade of war, leading to US efforts to bring peace, first in Bosnia in 1995, then in Kosovo after 1999, the war there, and leading ultimately to Milosevic's own downfall at the hands of his own people and the rise of a transitional new democracy in Serbia. So I think the lessons for us are that we want effective mediating institutions, strong democratic institutions, rule of law, an active citizen voice in politics to prevent the kind of catastrophe that residents of the former Yugoslavia lived through and produced terrible migration streams. You see something similar on an even larger scale today coming out of Syria, where a minority dictator is clinging on to power through violence with the support of Russia and Iran in a kind of malign authoritarian axis, producing the biggest wave of refugees really in many decades coming out of the Middle East and really destabilizing neighboring countries and regions, including Europe. So we care about good governance and democracy, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it does produce a degree of stability and progress that is otherwise just so absent. The Balkans were set back decades by the trauma of the 1990s, just as Europe was flourishing otherwise into a new era of peace and democracy.
Great. Question kind of for you both. One of the questions we did is, how do you think vaccine diplomacy will affect democracy throughout the world?
Steve.
Well, vaccine diplomacy is the issue at the forefront right now in many countries that we work in. And places like Ukraine and Moldova and Armenia are struggling to obtain vaccines. And so they're under pressure from their citizens. And Russia and China have been very, very open to providing this assistance. So the question for these governments that are trying to become a part of Europe is, how do we satisfy the citizen demand, resolve this health issue, but maintain our independence from authoritarian regimes like Russia and China? It's a very, very difficult choice. But we're seeing more and more countries. You've seen Hungary, you've seen Slovakia and others that are buying Sputnik vaccine from Russia or one of the various Chinese vaccines. So yes, Russia and China will use the provision of vaccines to further their political influence in these countries. So that's something that Dan and I are very, very watchful of. And we're going to see how this develops. Our hope is that particularly in Western Europe, vaccine development can accelerate to offset this push from Russia and China. But it doesn't look that way right now. Dan, do you have anything to add?
I just have maybe one thing to add with that is also the importance with the vaccine. Of course, it's going to allow more and more people to be able to travel and to conduct business. But my one concern is that obviously we know that the distribution of the vaccines throughout the world isn't quite equitable. There are many countries that are not able to obtain many vaccines. And what we don't want is to see a further divide of economic progress between kind of the first world and the third world countries due to maybe the restrictions and limitations of the vaccines. There's another question here that I think relates well to the business community, and maybe Dan, you might want to take this, is does IRI implement anti-corruption programs that can serve as models for reformers in other countries in the region?
Yeah, thanks. Another good question. There are so many good questions here. Yes, of course we do. Anti-corruption, concerns about corruption are a global driver of democratic protest and democratic change. Tom Carruthers at the Carnegie Endowment did a study a couple of years ago showing that something like 10% of all governments in the world in the past 5 years had changed fallen, or either in a kind of post-dictator context or through electoral change. But the 10% of all governments in the world had fallen because of corruption concerns on the part of citizens. So it's a huge driver of discontent. You see it particularly acutely now in the Middle East, where politics has not changed and opened up in the same degree that it has in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe over the past few decades. And we see a lot of people who still go into politics in many countries, not just in the Middle East, but in many countries, they go into politics to self-enrich rather than to serve citizens. And this drives people crazy. It has driven Russians into the streets of 110 cities over the past few months, protesting against the gross corruption of the Putin regime, which in many respects is better understood as kind of a mafia racket rather than a traditional government in terms of its predation and resource extraction to produce really quite rich income streams for a very small set of people at the top of government institutions. So yes, corruption is a huge driver. And we do a lot of work around this. We have an anti-corruption toolkit that we share. A lot of our work around civic and media watchdogs is designed to spotlight corrupt practices so that citizens can make a change for the better, hold politicians accountable. A lot of the work we do with political parties, we're a political party institute. A lot of our core engagement is with foreign political parties, is around non-corrupt practices so that they can govern and administer in more just ways. So I really appreciate the question, because no matter where you go in the world, no matter what they may think of the US or anything else, people get really upset about living in a corrupt country and having officials who do not serve them, but serve their own interests.
If I could just add to Dan's response, Michael, I would like to say that we do extensive polling in all the countries we work in, and anti-corruption is one of the areas that we really do a lot of research in. So we're able to field a poll and ask very detailed questions of respondents about, have you had to pay a bribe in the past year? If so, where and for what reason? So we've been able to say to someone like Maya Sandu, who was elected president of Moldova on an anti-corruption platform, exactly where people have experienced corruption, where they've been forced to pay bribes, whether that's at schools, it's at hospitals, or various licenses. That feeds into her campaign material, her strategy, her voter targeting, and her outreach. So we really, really help pro-democracy candidates in their campaigns on anti-corruption, because we provide them with data that helps them narrow their focus and direct their energies at the places where people feel corrupt acts have taken place.
And there's probably not a bigger stop sign than corruption to stop American companies from going into a particular country. So it's such a key and critical aspect. This question, I think, would be great for Mr. Nix. The Baltic States are still associated with the former Soviet Union, although they have been democratic, open market economies for 30 years. They are in the European Union and NATO for more than 15 years. They are OECD members for many years. What should happen so that they are no longer called, quote unquote, former USSR? How do you change this image?
Well, I would argue that the Baltic countries have distinguished themselves in drawing the distinction that they are no longer former Soviet republics. In fact, we refrain largely from using that term in describing the Baltic countries because they have been transformed. I mean, the questioner was correct in everything that he or she said about their transition from former Soviet republics to vital democracies that are not just members of the EU and NATO, but are playing a critical role in helping countries like Ukraine, like Moldova, like Russia and Belarus to try to transform their systems of government. So these Baltic countries are distinguishing themselves by the roles they're playing in helping countries that were in the same situation they were 20, 25 years ago. And I think that's crucial to the effort, and they are our great partners. And that's the main way they are distinguishing themselves between the past and the present.
Great. I think we have time for one more question because we want to be conscious of everybody's time. And so we're going to scan through these real quick. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. So maybe for the final question, we'll take something outside of the Eurasia region, and maybe this is something that Dr. Twining can address. Of course, we understand and we see the news every day on what's happening in Burma. So the question is IRI active in South Asia?
Yes, thank you. It's really a catastrophe what has happened in Burma. I mean, to recap in short, this country was a very transitional democracy. It wasn't a strong democracy. In fact, the military opened up in a very graduated way over the past decade, but retained all the levers of control. Control of a veto-proof majority of parliament, so a big chunk of parliamentary seats set aside for the armed forces, control of key institutions, the defense ministry, the interior ministry, etc. So the military has been wielding power behind the scenes, but there was kind of a parallel democratic civilian government operating at the same time. The military decided after the elections last November that the system that it itself has designed was no longer working. The military party was trounced in the polls. By a margin of more than 10 to 1, citizens across Burma voted for the democratic leadership of the NLD, the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi. They did not vote for the military political party. Even districts where there are military bases and government offices, meaning most people are on the payroll of the state, those districts voted for the civilian-led Democratic NLD. So the military leadership realized it could never win elections, despite the gerrymandered system it itself had created. And it overthrew the government. It arrested the president. The parliament, the new parliament elected by the people, was about to sit, and the tanks moved in and arrested all those parliamentarians that were the core of that country's democratic development. So it's a grim situation, but what has surprised the military is the national popular uprising that has resulted. Burma has something like 330 townships, including bigger cities and tiny smaller towns. And out of those 330, there have been civilian uprisings, democratic uprisings in 316 or so of them. So this is really a universal awakening across the country and fierce resistance by civilians against military control. It has also brought the ethnic groups in the north together with the mainstream Democrats who are Burman, ethnically Burman, the majority. It has really united the country. This was a very divided country, like the former Yugoslavia, that now is quite united around its rejection of military rule. So the military is in big trouble because the citizens are not consenting to its violent seizure of power. The military, by the way, cut off the internet, cut off phone lines. I mean, they moved this country back into the dark ages after they took power, which, of course, was just terrible for all businesses operating there, including many foreign businesses, who now enjoy no predictability, no rule of law, no dispute settlement in the courts. So it's a big step backward. The Burmese people are pushing back. We have been working there for many, many years, and many of our partners are in hiding, in detention. But we're really heartened. A parallel government has formed of the parliament that was never allowed to sit. And I think we're going to see some change there because this is just not what is done in the 21st century, and Burmese people are not standing for it.
Okay, great. And we're sorry about some of the echoing. Occasionally we'll have some of the audio looping with different microphones. We'll try and do some audio post-production the best that we can, because Dan, what you talked about in Southeast Asia was very important and gave us a lot of good context for that. And so I wanted to give each of you, we're wrapping up, as in we're out of time, and I wanted to thank both of you for coming to this event today with over 300 people registered for it. And Steve, Kim, I definitely want to thank you for making the pilgrimage to our office to set this up. And so for the audience that's new to Select Chicago, This is a taste of what we do. We do events like this once a month. Typically, it's a 3-party program. What we mean by that is we're talking about for an international audience looking to come to the United States, we highlight one municipality. So next week, we're going to be in the village of Elk Grove Village and talking about the largest industrial park in the world and how they've transformed over time. We're going to be setting up shop in one of their large industrial buildings right next to a new data center, Microsoft data center. Followed by that, we're going to have an hour presentation on the Philippines. So we're going to have the Consulate General of the Philippines in Chicago present why United States businesses should look at investing in the Philippines. And to add some seasoning to that, we have Matt DeCourcy with Full Scale IO, which is actually a Kansas City, Kansas company that has scaled up a large presence in the Philippines over the last couple of years. So he's going to be talking about what it's been like to actually set up businesses abroad. While we're finishing up next week, we're also going to have 3 companies come back and talk about the success they've had in starting up the United States. One of which was, we were really going to be excited having our Lithuanian friend speak next week, but he can't because he's actually going to be in the air flying back home. So in the show notes, we're going to have links to our programming, other ways you can get to know about Select Chicago. But I did want to offer everybody in turn, I'll start with Steve Kim because he's on my left, basically the ability to say thank you and go for it.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you for this opportunity. And thank you very much for IRI for coming here and being able to really demonstrate a little bit of what IRI is currently doing. I think we need many days to really talk about all the components of IRI, but I think this was a great initial encounter, and we hope that IRI will be back. I think it's very important that we here in Chicago, not in Washington, work more and more closely and collaborate with organizations, very important organizations in Washington, D.C. We hear a lot about the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, but it's also important that D.C. and people here in the Midwest and other local regions throughout the world understand the important work that organizations such as IRI have done and will continue to do. And I think it's also very important for businesses here in the Chicago region support and assist organizations like IRI so that IRI can continue to do its great work for many years to come. So thank you very much.
Great. So Steve Nix.
I would just like to thank you, Michael and Steve, for hosting us, giving this opportunity to talk about our work and the connections with what you're doing. I'll sum up by saying President Reagan, who's credited with founding the creation of IRI, once said, the reason why we want to build democracies is twofold. Democracies are good for peace because democracies don't attack each other militarily. And secondly, he said, democracies are good for business because they make for good trading partners. I think those words are the ties that bind what Chicago Select is doing, what IRI is trying to do, and binds us together. And our work together is very, very important going forward. So thank you again for this terrific opportunity.
Great. So Dan, last word. So take us away.
I would just like to thank you at Select Chicago. This was really a super opportunity. In addition to obviously just encouraging people, anyone who would like to volunteer, we have info@iri.org is a general email inbox. We also have, if you go to iri.org and click on Work With Us, job listings, because we're always looking to recruit great young talent from outside the Washington Beltway. So for those of you out there thinking about a career change, we'd love to talk to you as well. But could I just say thanks again? I think your leadership, your international vision there in Chicago is so important. And we just really appreciate the chance to do this with you. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Steve.
Great. And thank you, Dan. And actually, a last shout out to your staff. They've been really great to work with over the last couple of weeks getting prep for this. And when I get out to DC, I'm really excited to meet them one day. So again, thank you everybody for joining us on this special pop-up presentation for the Select Chicago FDI Workshop Series. We're going to be back next week, and we look forward to seeing you then. So have a great week, guys. Bye.